Hello, everyone, and welcome on this new episode of Education Futures. If you enjoyed our previous episodes, please give us a rating on your favorite podcast platform, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. It helps us a lot to have 5 stars reviews. So I count on you. If you have enjoyed the podcast so far, please give us a good rating. Today, we are very happy to have Michael Burgess with us. And welcome, Michael. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Fanny. It's great to be here.
Michael is a clear, bold voice on the future of higher education in the age of AI. And we're very happy to have this episode because we haven't really talked about the future of higher ed specifically. And I know that with Michael, we will. So, Michael, you are an education strategist, a transformation leader, known for calling out the uncomfortable truth. Higher education doesn't have a technology problem. It has a strategy problem. Universities fall in love with shiny tools, deploy them on top of broken processes, and then wonder why nothing changes. Your writing and thinking challenges institutions to rethink AI not as a teaching experiment or a classroom add-on, but as an operating model shift. A redesign of how work gets done across people, policies, processes, culture, and only then technology. And you argue that AI won't disrupt universities, it will expose them, and that higher ed must be courageous enough to cannibalize parts of its own business model and rethink what entry-level work means for graduates, and rebuild around deeply human learning. So, Michael, we are thrilled to have you on the podcast today. Maybe you want to introduce yourself, your work, what you've done in your career to us before we start with the hard questions.
Yes, sure, Svenja. So I've had an interesting career. I've spent most of it in the commercial sector. I started life, I'm in Australia, started life in Melbourne, studied at Melbourne University. My first job was as a commodity trader of all things. And then I sort of went down the marketing, customer experience, product path. I then got into strategy, corporate strategy, innovation. And I guess the common thread running through my career prior to joining higher education was that I was always drawn to challenges. I guess I consider myself a change agent, and I always liked the idea of sort of assisting either organizations or sectors to meet those challenges. And in a previous role prior to getting into this sector, I was actually the CMO for Weight Watchers Australasia, and in that role, I was on a global innovation team looking at innovation and looking at disruption. And there was one sector that stood out as not having been disrupted, and that was education. And yet all the conditions were more than ripe for it, and that it sort of piqued my interest. So when I left Weight Watchers, I had a conversation with one of the big universities over here, Western Sydney University, and I had no intention of joining higher ed or joining university, but then I found myself as I think the sector's first chief student experience officer at Western Sydney. I was there for 7.5 years. We did, I think, a lot of good things, a few different things. I would have liked to have done a lot more, but then left on great terms, and now I've been advising back to the sector. And I think it couldn't have been a better time because, as you said, the whole world's going through significant change. The sector has to change, and if it doesn't, then the traditional model, I think, will become obsolete largely.
Absolutely. And you've said in one of your writings, I follow your writings quite closely. I really like what you write, what you post on social
Thank
media
you.
about the topic. You've said that higher ed is being disrupted by AI. It's not being disrupted by AI, sorry, it's being exposed by it. What do you mean
Mm.
by that?
Well, it's interesting. If we look at the higher education model, it really hasn't changed for literally centuries. I was quite shocked when I joined the sector 10 years ago at just how little had changed and how insular the sector was. And I spent the first 5 years in a senior role in a large university with over 50,000 students, going around and telling the disruption story and pushing for change and pushing for clear strategy to respond to change. And sorry, you there, Svenja?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, sorry, I lost you there for a second. Um, the so when I joined the sector, I was really quite shocked at how little had changed and how little there was an external focus on what was happening in the macro environment. Very little understanding of the customer or the student. I intentionally call them the customer, and little understanding of the marketplace. And that for me is a sure sign that a sector is exposed and at risk. So I spent the first 5 years prosecuting the case for change, and I was met with a lot of looks of disdain, or you don't know what you're talking about. But in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a very significant shift across the sector as everyone realizes that not only is change going to happen, it is happening. So we've got a bit of a rabbits in the headlight moment at the moment, where there's a lot of fear, a lot of apprehension, and a lot of institutions just not knowing how to move forward.
Absolutely. What exactly is AI exposing about universities today? Like, what do you see are the things that don't work, that haven't really worked in the past? And now that AI is here, it's clearly it's becoming even clearer that these things
Mm.
don't work.
Well, interestingly, I think the exposing started prior to AI. It's just that there was a lot of myopic views and a lot of people and institutions with their heads in the sand, not wanting to realize the fact that the model was being exposed. I mean, if you look at a lot of the lead indicators showing the declining relevance of education, of higher education, student dissatisfaction, dropping completion rates, all of these factors. And then if you also look at the increasing gap between what industry needs and what's being delivered through the education sector, these signals were there prior to AI. What AI has done is as we all know, accelerated them significantly,
Yeah.
and really just thrown everything on its head. And I think the other thing it's done is it's lowered the barriers significantly. So if you think about universities, and this is a question I used to like asking within universities, which is a pretty sobering question, and that is, where does the inherent value lie in a university? Once upon a time, it used to be knowledge. Arguably, there's greater knowledge to be gained, and certainly more immediate knowledge to be accessed outside of universities. Distribution will now, that barrier's fallen. Really, the one thing that universities have to hang on to is credentialing, and that's now starting to crumble. So, I think this combination of effects, combined with a rapid speeding up of technology-driven change in the marketplace, which requires significant and immediate change in how people are being skilled and the kinds of individuals that are completing their studies and going into the marketplace, has exposed one of the biggest issues universities have, and that is they're way too slow and lacking too much in innovation around the product itself. The number of times I've had conversations where universities will say, well, we have a 2.5 year cycle for creating and delivering a product to market, which means that anyone who's starting a degree, by the time they've finished, it will be 5 years since that degree was 5 or 6 years since that degree was first initiated. That's clearly just way too slow and not appropriate for what we're dealing with today.
I, I wanted to change it a bit with another disruption that happened, and that was not that much of a disruption. I'm thinking about massive online courses. Like 10 years ago, we had the same wording, like what's important is knowledge, and knowledge now is a commodity because you can get Harvard course online. The disruption is here. Like we had basically the same wording as what you just said. So what? And I totally agree that things are different, but why are they different now with AI?
Yeah, it's a great question. Firstly, I would say the sector sees MOOCs as having failed. I'm actually not sure that that's true. If you look at the number of people who have commenced courses with MOOCs, they may not have completed them, but they may have done what they desired to do. So I wouldn't say it's an outright failure, that model. But I think what's more important and more relevant to your question is, and there's a great quote which I like to give around disruption, and it's something I read many years ago in regards to disruption, and it references that wonderful quote out of Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, where the protagonist is asked how he went bankrupt, and he says 2 ways: gradually, then suddenly. And this article talked about disruption working in the same way, and I've seen this close up in commercial environments. Quite often you'll see, the risk of competitive threats, disruptive threats on the horizon, and they come up and they fall short, and then everyone relaxes and said, see, there's nothing to worry about. And then third or fourth wave, whack, a marketplace is disrupted. So it doesn't always happen first time around. It quite often takes time. But I think, and the other huge change clearly is we didn't have generative AI back when MOOCs were formed. And I think that's a game. Well, I think there's enough commentary out there talking to the fact that that's a game changer that's having profound implications across all sectors and across all operating models. So I think that's the big change.
Yeah, sure. It just reminds me of a French movie. I'm not sure about the translation, but it's called The Fall, and it's the story of a man that falls from the 15th floor, and it says, "So far, so good. So far, so good." And what matters is not the fall; it's when you land. So I guess that's kind of the same story.
Absolutely.
Well, and I had personal lived experience working for Weight Watchers, who was the global leading weight loss brand for over 50 years. Incredibly successful business, but it was a business that rested on its laurels. And it was too late when they finally realized the need for change. And that was the global innovation team that I joined to try and combat the forces at play. Weight Watchers went bankrupt this year, and it's just one of many, many, many examples. The Fortune 500, what was it, 50 odd years ago, the average life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company was 75 years. Today, it's 15 years and declining rapidly. So
very interesting.
times have changed.
And everyone nowadays, everyone claims to be doing AI transformation. And I know you have an issue with that wording, with the transformation word. Why are we misusing the word transformation?
So I'm going to channel the amazing Clayton Christensen, the doyen of disruptive innovation, who came up with disruptive innovation theory from Harvard, who did talk to this. Unfortunately, he's passed away, but he used to talk to this very eloquently and talk about the fact that transformation doesn't happen in organizations. Very, very, very rarely across any sector. And the reason why, by definition, transformation means radically changing the model, radically changing the operations, radically changing the proposition. And the reason why that is so difficult is because of the greatest impediment to any significant change, which is the status quo. And that is all of those things that have gone to make an organization what it is. Its policies, its processes, most importantly, its culture, and also its value model. Commercial organizations are designed around optimizing usually shareholder return. And over time, they're fine-tuned to do that. Now, to then go and say, we're going to change that model so that we can survive with a transformed new model into the future, it's just too hard. It doesn't happen. What does happen is you get disruptive innovation typically coming from new entrants into the marketplace. They typically start off with an inferior product serving a market or a segment that has been underserved or not served. And then over time, they improve that product and it becomes superior to the incumbents that it was once competing against. And that's typically how innovation is driven through sectors. So if you think about Toyota in the 70s, went into the US car market with an inferior product, ended up dominating that marketplace. And there's many, many other examples. So this isn't targeted specifically at higher education. I think for universities, it's even more difficult for all of the reasons we know about universities being, very bureaucratic and hierarchical, and because of the cultures, and it's really hard for them to shift and change. But you look across any sector, and it's just impossible to transform most organisations. And the reason why I have a problem with the terminology of transformation is because you see it, and I've seen it now for many, many years. Every organisation has transformation teams. They've got transformation projects, and almost always what happens is a lot of money is spent, a lot of blood, sweat and tears goes into the effort, and then at the end of it, there's very little to see for that effort. And what that does is create cynicism, exhaustion, change fatigue within organisations. So I prefer to frame it as Roger L. Martin, the fabulous Canadian strategist, does, as the concept of betterment. So instead of trying to transform an organization, look at how you can incrementally make it better and better. And if you can do that, then you can deliver what Christensen called sustained innovation. Apple are very good at that. Right? They came out with the transformative innovation, and now they've just sustained that over time so that they retain relevance.
Where should universities start nowadays if they want to get better and better? Like, where should they start, and where should they look first? Maybe on a workflow that doesn't work anymore, that AI is exposing even more. What do you think?
So I'll get on one of my hobby horses here. I think where they should start is with the customer or the student. Now, there's different customer groups for universities. There's obviously the students, and there's also industry. And there's also, at another level, government. But I think what universities have been woefully bad at is understanding their customer and understanding the marketplace. When I started at Western Sydney Uni 10 years ago, I was shocked to see that, ironically, for an evidence-based learning institution, we had no evidence base. We didn't understand the basics around student experience. We didn't understand basics like what informs what preferences students would make. So prospective students who decide which university to go to, buyer behaviour, to use a dirty commercial term, we didn't understand what influenced that, for example. So we spent a lot of time and effort building a deep understanding of that. In the absence of having that, all you do is it comes down to anecdotes and second guesses and what individuals think is the right thing to do. So that would be the starting point for me. Alongside that, you don't need to wait to build that. Alongside that, what I would do is what I call bottom-up innovation. Once again, I think the sector has a history of tackling these problems the wrong way, and that is they start at the top. Technology is a great example. They have these incredibly complex systems, and they try and resolve the enterprise architecture and get all of their tech sorted, spend incredible amounts of money, and don't end up shifting any dials, don't end up improving customer experience, don't end up, delivering outcomes because they've tackled it the wrong way. If you go to the front line, you go to those staff who deal with these sorts of issues every day, they know where the main challenges are to be resolved. So if you get a combination of that and students together in co-design, then you can start to knock off the big issues one by one, and incrementally, and this is the betterment concept, incrementally improve the experience and most importantly, improve student outcomes.
Mm. And coming back to AI, um, if a university wants to adopt AI the right way, does
Mhm.
it needs to start with giving staff access to AI individually, or what would you say is the
Mm.
right way to implement AI in a meaningful way?
Yeah, it's another great question. I'm spending a lot of time, like many of us are now, understanding AI and understanding how it can enable outcomes. First thing I'd say is we need to reframe the whole narrative around AI. This isn't about AI, delivering AI. This isn't about AI change. This is about business change, business innovation, of which AI is an enabler. But it can't be done in isolation. It has to be done in combination with, the old processes, people, policy is a big one within universities. So it's that combination that can deliver meaningful change for institutions. The way to do it, there's now quite a bit of evidence. We kind of forget that, it's still early days, isn't it? What is it, 3 years since Gen
Mm,
AI was launched?
yeah.
But there is now, I think, enough evidence to, you look at the MIT studies and there's a bunch of studies out there which talk to how effective or not AI investment has been for organizations. And I think some of the key learnings are, firstly, yes, give staff and students access to the tools and let them play. Really important. And ideally give them access to multiple tool sets. But then what's very important is to firstly appoint someone to take ownership and lead the institution through this process. Secondly, to have some very clear manifesto around what AI means in the context of the institution, because one of the biggest inhibitors is fear. And particularly in risk-averse organizations like universities, people will go off and do their own sort of skunk works and their own bits on the side, but everyone's fearful of breaking policy, of data breaches, of all of those sorts of things. So be very clear about what AI means for the institution and what outcomes it will deliver, which includes, you know, clarifying that it's not about losing jobs, because if you ever want to demotivate people from embracing a technology, that's it. If they think it's going to replace their job. And then the other, I think, key learning is start with few POCs, look for some big opportunities, provide some rigor around them, some strategy, and then work on those, work them up, hopefully have them succeed, and then move on to the next one, capture those learnings, and then deliver those learnings and capabilities across the institution, which is kind of similar to how I believe it's the learning I've had from working within a university, is that bottom up, work on something, work it up, and then scale it up, or then move on to the next piece. You've got to chunk these things down.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. But, I'm really questioning myself about the role of university in an AI age. Like in the AI age, where we see that, entry level jobs are at risk, where we see that knowledge is accessible to the many, accessible everywhere. Everyone has a
Mhm.
private tutor in their pocket. Why should we still go to university? What is its role fundamentally in society?
Um, I think how I look at this is it comes down to how we define university, or what we consider to be university. The default is often to look at the university as it's always been, because it's always been the same. if we're talking about that university, well, I think it is absolutely declining in relevance, and it will not meet the needs of future markets, future individuals into the future. However, universities, I think, still have an absolutely fundamental role to play within within countries and globally, and they are required for a lot of that fundamental knowledge, practices that are probably even more important today than ever. You know, how are we going to learn about history? How are we going to learn about ethics? How are we going to learn about all of those fundamental learnings that you would go to a university to skill up on? So I think there's absolutely a role for them, and of course, there will be a role for universities around research. I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a change from, certainly in this country, where we have a whole series of 42 comprehensive universities that are basically selling the same thing, delivering the same thing. That just doesn't make sense in a world where there is different need sets, different sectors require different specialties. So I think we're going to see much more of a tailoring of the marketplace, and we're going to see a lot more different models entering the market. And I'll give you a great example of that. I used to go over to the US to see all the tech firms in the Pacific Northwest, and I'd hear the same story every time, and that is we cannot get today what we need within 10 years at a 500-mile radius in terms of tech skills. So, you know, whether it be coders, data analysts, project managers, etc. And I come back to my team back here and say, watch this space, because industry doesn't wait for a sector to deliver something over 10 years. Then what happened? Google Career Certificates were born. There's now been over 8 million of them commenced, 1.5 million graduated, over 300 technology companies hire off the back of people who have undertaken career certificates that cost about $600 and take between 6 and 9 months. So I think that's a really good example of where we're going to start to see these different offerings in markets delivering different needs outside of the traditional university model.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what is your ideal, in the ideal scenario, the university of the
Mm-hmm.
future that really delivers on all the points that we mentioned so far? How does it look like? What does this university do better or differently? How does it implement AI? Even like physically, I'm interested in knowing if you imagine them happening like in a physical space, or if it's virtual
Mm-hmm.
universities. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the university of the future.
Another easy question you've got for me there. Well, I'm going to cheat a bit and say I don't think there is a university of the future. No, that's to my earlier point. I think there
Mhm.
needs to be a number of different models, different offerings, different solutions in market. That's where we have to change. And in the Australian context, if I was the education minister, I'd be taking a couple of $1 billion, putting it aside, getting the brightest minds, a lot of them from outside the sector, and building from the ground up. I know that's what Paul LeBlanc and George Siemens are looking at doing with their interesting startup that they've kicked off. So I think we need a number of different models, but if I had to try and sort of generalize in terms of what this would look like, it would be deeply understanding of the market, deeply understanding of its customers. It would be highly responsive. It would be low cost. The cost burden on universities is just way too high. They are way too inefficient, and we need to strip away all of that inefficiency. And people sometimes kind of get a bit offended by that, but the reality is that universities have a lot of people doing a lot of very inefficient activities that add no value. Now strip away that, make that more efficient, and guess what? They can then focus on value adding, serving their customer better, serving students, serving industry better. So I think we've got to do all of those things. It needs to absolutely be much more data-driven. AI does play an important role in this. It has to be flexible. It'll be borderless. That's already starting to happen. You know, if you've got Arizona State University saying they're going to have a $250 million student initiative, watch this space because they'll get there. So, we need to be thinking much bolder, bigger, and more aggressively about what these new models look like and acting on it.
Just a quick question, and after I have a longer one. One of the aspects you mentioned was you think this ideal university will be cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree that the value for the price today is not good, but I guess there will be another option to say that for the same price you just have a way better education system. I don't know, like it's so why would you think or want education to be cheaper?
I want it to be, firstly, I want it to be cheaper because ultimately the student pays. They either pay directly, or in a market like Australia, they have deferred loans, so they pay it back over time, or the taxpayer pays or subsidises. Whichever way you look at it, someone is paying. This isn't a free lunch for anybody. And I just think markets, when you've got a regulated market, as we've had globally for so long, you don't really have a choice. That's now starting to change. And so people will vote with their feet. So if traditional models don't start to drive cost out, they will just price themselves out, and they'll also go out of business. We're seeing that over here where, there was there's been a significant number of the universities in the red. I mean, the UK, US, everywhere it's happening. And that's, a significant part of that is because we've got these very inefficient, costly models. If I look at Scott Pulsifer, who runs Western Governors University in the US, really interesting guy, an example of a sort of a new type of vice chancellor or president. He came from Amazon online store, and he has intentionally gone down the path of creating a low-cost option in the marketplace. So it's a classic sort of Michael Porter strategy, right? Low cost or high value. Because he knows there's a market out there for students who don't want to or can't afford to pay for all of the trappings, all the sporting facilities and all that other stuff that goes with universities, and they don't want it. Google Career Certificate's another great example. There's a fascinating professor of marketing who has created a mini MBA, Mark Ritson, who you may know of. He's now gone off and created his own platform, and it costs about about £3,000, I think. If I was a CMO today, I would be hiring someone who had done that versus someone who had done an MBA or a marketing degree every single day. So I think you can come up with much better propositions at a much lower cost to the consumer.
Absolutely. And we also see this trend everywhere. In Europe, we have players that do that. For example, Iconoclast in Europe does this 3-month sales training. It's intensive to just to teach the basics of sales. And they have a 98% placement rate after 6 months, right? I mean, these new models, 3 months, it's nothing. And at the same time, they learn hands-on. They learn from the industry. They learn with the industry. They are placed there on small internships, on small assignments, and it's really, really hands-on. And they learning by doing 3 months, and that really causes an important question about the role of these 3 to 4 to 5 year long degrees. I mean, if you don't want to go into research, why do you need to do a 5-year-long degree? I'm playing devil's advocate here, but, I'm really questioning that. If you don't want to do some really high core mathematics applications, why should you stay 5 years in a university studying? Laurent, what do you think about that?
I totally agree. And just stepping back on the whole conversation, I would say so. I guess one of your points, maybe I'm phrasing it differently, that we should invest massively in innovation. Like we just need to build new models. One of the aspects is like if you are running a university right now, what do you do? Because you know there is the innovator dilemma, and disruption is supposed to come from outside of yourself. So your point is, if you're running a university, still invest in innovation and just try to make small steps in this direction. I love that you say that future of education is plural. That's why we call our podcast Education Futures. My point is, do you think that like this innovation can come from universities and from outside of it? But is it a 50-50, or in reality, do you think that like 90% will come from outside of university and only 10% from university, or like what's the balance?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess that depends how you quantify it. I think true disruptive innovation, as I said earlier, I think probably needs to come from outside the university model for all the reasons I said. That said, I think there needs to be an enormous amount of incremental innovation occurs within institutions because they're becoming so far behind. I mean, these models are, by any standard, looking across any sector, are just lagging so much on a whole lot of factors that I think there needs to be a huge amount, and there is starting to be. So I'm not, and you know, I want to be clear too. I'm not kind of picking on universities. It's difficult. It's really, really hard. And the settings have meant that they haven't had to change over time. But I think there needs to be a lot within, but there needs to be a lot from without. And I suspect what's going to happen is, if we look over, I don't know, 5-10 year time horizon, the world around us is going to change so much and so quickly that increasingly the innovation will come from outside. It'll become like the Google Career Certificates, because industry, all of those stakeholders are going to need answers that they're not going to get from traditional sources, largely being universities. So I think you got to see this. I mean, you know, look at some of the sort of the lead indicators of this. I mean, the Chat GPTs of the world, who are now starting to encroach on education. You know, Microsoft tried it with LinkedIn. You can only see them going down that path. Why are they all doing this? For two reasons. In general, one, because they want to get the best talent and they want to keep their own talent skilled over time. But secondly, because it is such a big, lucrative sector. It's too attractive to ignore. So yeah, I think we're going to, what's protected the moat around the sector to date has been largely public policy. I think that's going to change as well. As you know, in Australia, we just had a productivity roundtable, which the government called, where there's a huge issue with lagging productivity in the country. And there's a lot more focus, and people are being a lot more honest and bold about calling out the fact that the education sector just isn't driving enough innovation and not delivering enough skilled individuals to meet the needs of the future. So I think it's going to be a combination of factors, but over time it will be largely from outside traditional models.
Thank you, Michael. One last question that we love to ask all of our guests is that we are an interdisciplinary podcast. We love to have lots of different points of view on this podcast on the future of education, more largely, and yeah, we would love to know if you have any suggestions for future guests. So guests could be, you know, working in the education space or doing something completely differently. We'd love to have people from outside the education sector to also share their feelings and their thinking with us. We'd love to have a variety of different voices. So we're very keen to know who you would recommend.
So I'm going to cheat again and give you two, if that's okay. Because I think two vastly different perspectives on this challenge would be interesting. So the first one would be if you could get I mean, there's no demand for these people, but if you could get one of the sort of the leading thinkers in the whole AI space in terms of their vision, who could articulate not just what's happening and what the technology can do, but what impact they see that happening over the short to medium term, I think that could be profound, because one problem is, this is well known, humans looking at the future use kind of linear projections because that's the way we sort of process these things. Whereas what we're dealing with here is extreme exponentiality. So somebody who's going to come and give a very stark kind of view of what that looks like and the implications, I think, would be unsettling in a good way. But the other one, more from an educational context, was the fellow I mentioned earlier, Paul LeBlanc, who is an extraordinary individual and a very nice man. He took Southern New Hampshire University from a small regional institution to over 250,000 students. But more importantly, it's his outlook and his perspective on the world and education, which I think is just one of those things. If you could bottle it, it'd be priceless. And I think everybody should get to listen to Paul LeBlanc. I think we'd all be better off for it.
Thank
Yeah,
you so much, Michael, for your time today and for being with us on the podcast.
absolute pleasure. Thanks very much.